So yeah, please do go ahead and look at these other videos. As I said, I won't be looking at that. The Belmont report, the reason why I put something there on the Belmont report is because that's really quite an important part of that lecture. So you should sort of read up about that. Also, copyrights, obviously. So when we're talking about internet research ethics, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about also just includes general research ethics. But of course, nowadays with the internet, we have to look at it that way. So I'm going to have to download this. Just going to, right. So today we're going to talk about, as I said, internet research ethics. I think this little diagram on the side here is quite useful for that purpose, because we see there with a lot of images, a lot of the different issues that are important with internet research ethics. So you see there things like plagiarism. Actually, that's just a big thing in research anyways. When I'm talking about research there, I mean kind of like academic research. Well, no, but even journalistic research, are you copying somebody else's work? These other things kind of relate to that, the authorship, who actually authored it. Then we have some things there about copyright, because if you are quoting or borrowing somebody else's work, that's okay, as long as you get the permission or you use fair use. Fair use doctrine, the idea of fair use is that you can use copyrighted materials, snippets of them. You can't take a whole book and use it, or a whole article and use it without permission, but you can take parts of it as long as it's for educational purposes, right? If you're taking somebody's copyrighted material and you're using it to make money, that's a different thing, right? But if you're taking somebody's copyrighted material and you're using it for educational purposes, there is a fair use thing in that. Conflicts of interest. A classic conflict of interest, back in the 1960s, the tobacco companies, they paid for a number of doctors and other scientists who worked with human physiology and human health, and they had them test the effects of smoking. And of course, these doctors and scientists were paid by the tobacco companies, and they wrote reports based on their limited knowledge at that time, but there was some knowledge contrary to what they were putting, that smoking was good, and that pregnant women should smoke, and if you smoke, it's going to be good for you, it'll stop you having diabetes and all this kind of stuff. Now that's not going to fly, right? I mean, we've been shown that wasn't quite right. So that's a conflict of interest. So what I mean by that being a conflict of interest, if you put that into a medical journal, or you present it to the public without mentioning that you were paid by XYZ tobacco company, then that is a conflict of interest, because you're getting a benefit from doing some research which is you're not disclosing, and which is affecting your research. So I mean, the one which is kind of a controversial one at the moment is also the large oil and gas companies. And I'm not talking about Qatar Gas, that's big, but I'm talking about ExxonMobil. Their scientists back in the 1970s were able to determine and to predict that the use of fossil fuels at the exponential rate that it was growing at that time would lead to a climate change, which would give us all kinds of issues. And of course, they've been denying that ever since, but they sort of knew that, right? And, so they've been producing all kinds of other stuff. Yeah. So yeah, conflict of interest would be like that. You're working for somebody, you have, the old way we used to say this is, you have a dog in this fight. You have a benefit that's coming to you by presenting a particular way of doing research. So, I mean, if you were the scientist working for ExxonMobil, maybe you're getting a couple $100,000 a year out of that, right? From ExxonMobil. They might not, that's cheap. That's chump change, right? Because they make a lot more money by selling oil. Non-disclosure of safety procedures. Now, a lot of these things get to do with working with people. So if you're doing research which involves you having to interact with people, wow, you got a lot of ethical issues that are involved with that. And, you know, maybe there's some safety issues that need to be addressed. Maybe there's some informed consent that you are actually gathering data from people, and do they know what you're going to do with the data? That's informing them, and how it's going to be used. And then, did they agree? Simultaneous submission just means, well, somebody else unknown to you or perhaps known to you has done the same research and they submitted at the same time. Was there any interaction between you? That would be a duplicate submission. I'm not sure what they mean by salami slicing, to be honest, because whenever I've seen this term, we used to refer to it as a form of fraud that was perpetrated against like financial institutions. So we refer to the salami method fraud in a bank. How that would work is somebody who's a programmer maybe, or has programming skills, works at the bank, and they write a little program or a little virus or a little exploit, which does something like, you know, takes half a real from everybody's account and then sends it to their account. Hey, you know, half a real, people look at their account and they won't even notice it, right? But, you know, there's millions of accounts and that becomes a lot of money. That's what we call a salami method. I don't know what it means here by salami slicing. I suppose it could be stealing other people's ideas, but just a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there and a little bit there. I think it might be like that. So, I mean, that's this idea of plagiarism where we're stealing somebody else's ideas. It's okay to refer to somebody else's idea, but you have to say, so-and-so said this, and I agree or I disagree. You can't say, I said this, and it was so-and-so's idea. You see what I'm saying? That's what we mean by plagiarism. It's okay to say, you know, there's this researcher out there and they came up with this great idea, and I agree. You can say that. That's no problem. But you can't say, oh, this is my idea, when it's clearly somebody else's. And you would find that problem here at the university when you write any reports. If we have software like Turnitin software, how Turnitin software works is it's got millions and millions of articles and assignments that are done by students, and it's this huge database, right? You take the student's assignment and you put it into the database, and it checks to see if anybody else submitted anything like that. And if they did, boom, you get a big red thing, you know, and it has matching, right? So you turn it in and it says like 20% matching. All right, you know, people write in the same way. But, you know, if it says like 90% matching, well, they just stole that, right? I mean, that is, somebody's going to get kicked out of the university for that. You know what I'm saying? All right, so we get the idea. There's a lot of stuff there. So what is research? There's some important words in that term there. Research is creative, so that means we're doing something new. And the new thing is the general knowledge that's in the world. I mean, if you should add all the knowledge in the world of all the things that all the people know, by the end of your research, it should be more, right? I guess the world should be smarter after you did your research. So that something is new and learned. So how do we do it? This is actually the scientific method down here at the bottom. Hypothesis is formed. Hypothesis is just saying, I think this happens because of this. All right, so now I'm going to design some way of testing to see if this happens because of this. So that's my research methods are designed. Then I'm going to collect some data from that. And then I will analyze that data, and I'll see if my analysis of the data supports the idea that this is caused by that. And then I write that up as a report. You could call it a thesis if you wanted. And then that, or a dissertation, or just a research. And then you submit that and publish it. So you might just submit it and publish it to your university if you're a student. So that could just be a big assignment that you do. Maybe at the end of your degree, you do a sort of one semester where you just do this big assignment, and that could be a research report. But it's published. And then the university will keep that on their database so that other people can refer to it. So it has added to the knowledge. A better way, I suppose, and especially if it's really good research, is that nice research and conclusions are then published in what we call a peer-reviewed journal. So a peer-reviewed journal is going to have, when we say a peer, that's people that are like the researcher. So that would be like academic people, PhDs. So people will review the article and say, yeah, that article looks okay. And of course, so what they'll be looking at is, do the research methods support the conclusions? Has it added anything good to us? Do we actually know more because of this research? And if they think it does, then that gets published. So, research ethics. Some of these things I've sort of mentioned already in the previous slides. We do have to be responsible, and so we've got that responsibility to the general world of researchers. So we have to be honest in the way that we do our research, but we also have, and this is maybe the harder one, we have a responsibility to the people who are going to be affected by our research. So we have to make sure that in our gathering of our data for our research, that nobody is injured or harmed. And we particularly have to be concerned about vulnerable groups. Now, when I say vulnerable groups, immediately the easiest one to understand would be like children. So we have to understand, we have to make sure that our research doesn't somehow injure people who are vulnerable, or even people who otherwise we might think are not vulnerable. There's a lot of ways of doing research. We can think of these. Say you're a telecommunications expert. That's what you've decided to do in cybersecurity or something like that. You could probably organize a research project which didn't involve people, right? It just involves some physics and some math and, gathering a bunch of experiments that you did in a laboratory. That'd be awesome, because that would be the easiest research to get through a university. If you start dealing with people, then you have all of these ethical issues that you have to get through. And every university now has what we call an institutional review board. And what they will do is they will make sure they will not allow you to do your research unless your research passes what they call an ethical review. And what that ethical review will do is to make sure that, okay, you're not getting information from students, from children. You're not having any conflict of interest. I'll give you an example of a conflict of interest. In teaching, we have this concept of action research. And what action research is teachers, they're going to do their master's degree in education or a PhD in it or something like that. And they'll say, I got this great idea. This is my hypothesis. I got this great idea. If we changed our teaching from this way of teaching to that way of teaching, we'd get better results. Our students would do better and stuff like that. So I'm going to do some action research. I'm going to try this. I'm going to test the results beforehand. Then I'm going to test the results afterhand, and then that will support my hypothesis or not. So that's action research. The problem with that is quite possibly you might want to do something like, at the end of that research of me gathering that information, I'm going to ask the students, did you learn stuff from this? When we changed it, was it better for you? This kind of thing, right? In which case, I have a potential conflict of interest because they're my students, right? Action research, they must be my students because I'm testing it in the classroom. And so they're my students. So can you see the conflict of interest? The conflict of interest is if they say bad things about the research, they get a lower mark, right? You see what I'm saying? Very bad. And so that particular type of research would be very hard to get through an ethical review board. It's possible, but you'd have to do all kinds of sort of special things to ensure like every student's response would have to be anonymous. I mean, a lot of really hard work so that you couldn't know. It's just way too much trouble. Probably what getting it through an ethical review board, it would drive you crazy, to be honest. And so, that's the modern world. We'll talk about that a little bit too. Right, so there are different ways of gathering information. These ones here are focused on getting data from people. You survey them, you ask them questions, whatever. If you were a physical scientist, you wouldn't be getting your data from people, right? You'd be getting it from a laboratory. That would be easier. You wouldn't have to pass the ethical review board. You still have to pass the ethical review board, but it would be easier because no people are involved. So I hope these are kind of obvious. In your gathering of data, you must be honest. Objectivity means that you don't have your finger on the scale. It's kind of like being honest. Integrity, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. That's integrity, right? Carefulness, kind of be professional. Share your data with other people. Don't sort of hide it away. Don't steal other people's stuff, stealing their copyrights, stealing their intellectual property. Confidentiality, we have a slide about confidentiality, so I'll talk about that later. Responsible publication, if you're doing research in a university thing, and maybe you will, then you should publish that. And I mentioned a couple ways you could do that, right? If you have a dissertation, that will be published by the university. That'll be on a database somewhere and other people can access it. If you, or you can put it to a journal. Responsible mentoring. This is kind of an idea that's been in universities since the first universities, I don't know, 1,200 years ago or something like that, which is basically that the people who are experienced researchers, they work with less experienced researchers and they work in teams, and the less experienced researchers are taught by example from the more experienced researchers how to do it. So typically you'll have like a PhD at a university and you'll have graduate students, and the graduate students each have small projects that they work on and they work towards their degrees. And that sort of fits into a broad research area of interest of that PhD. All right, so yeah, respect your colleagues. I hope that makes sense. Treat them fairly. That includes, actually, one of the articles in the reading about this was about some researchers who were kind of bullies. So yeah, like the PhD guy is bullying around the students, that kind of stuff. That actually happens. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that sometimes where you have people that are very brilliant, and of course, if you want to have research, you want to have brilliant people. Sometimes brilliant people do have little flaws. They might have personality sort of things to do with large egos and stuff like that. All right, so non-discrimination. Yeah, obviously your research should not separate people in ways that do not impact upon their merit. And so that you could do that in selection of your data, which could be quite harmful. And I'll give you an example of that a bit later on, I think. Competence, yeah, you need to be knowing what you're doing. You need to do things legally. Don't hurt animals, and don't hurt people. Pretty good idea, right? I hope that's obvious. Right, so the internet is a tool. We're referring to this term here, internet research ethics. We use the tool in the internet is that you can have access to databases. We've got Wikipedia. That's not really a good research tool. You shouldn't do that. Google, not great either. But if you really want to use a search engine like that, which is just open to everybody, you can go Google Scholar. Okay, Google Scholar, and I think Microsoft has one as well. Michael Scholar. If you sort of check on Google Scholar, all the results that it'll give you from any query will be things that have been published in journal articles. So you're getting good stuff instead of random stuff, videos of cats and stuff like that. You'll get actual research if you use the Google Scholar search engine. Most universities either have available in the university itself, or they have access to special search tools that just search particular databases of articles that they have to pay for. So you'll find that if you go and do some research, that there'll be articles. I want to read this article, and then you go and find it, and got to pay $30 for it. And so what do? Well, if you go through the university library, usually they will have a facility there that'll allow you to do that often without having to pay. So they can be quite good. Yeah, so we've got these other things here. This is MUDs and MOOs. MUDs are like online sites where you play a game and you text and interact with the other players. Yeah, everybody does that, right? My daughter does that. And MOOs is just a special kind of MUD where you have a, it says it's object oriented. So I'm not sure because I haven't used these, but I think by that it means that you can interact with avatars. And so that would be good. why I say I think it means you can interact with avatars is because an avatar is an object, right? So when you do your object-oriented programming, you guys will do some of that. You know that you can create an object, and objects have particular attributes. And yeah, so that sounds to me like what an avatar would be. All right, so as it says there, the thing about research is that a lot of people have been doing it for a long time, and stuff that they've been doing in other areas of research, which you might not be doing directly, can help you in your research. So in particular, it mentions here medical research and humanistic and social science research. When you go to write any research report, thesis, you'll be required to use a style. So you may have heard of APA or MLA. Any of you guys heard of these, right? So these styles, these are actually determined by, for example, social science. APA is the American Psychology. All right, so they have a particular way that all their reports have to be. And then the MLA, et cetera. So the various professions, they give us a lot of help in that. With medical traditions, as it says, there's certain medical ethics that we need to sort of adhere to, basically, which is don't hurt people. There's a couple of videos. I did give you some videos. If you watch those videos, one of them actually talks about where did we start having these medical ethics? And it actually references the very terrible experiments that happened during World War II, where people in concentration camps were actually experimented upon as if they were non-human objects. So, very terrible. I mean, people were put in cold water to see how long it would take them to die of being cold and stuff like that. Now, obviously, you can't do that. Now, the people who are doing those research back in those days, they would say, all right, we got a good reason for doing this, because if we know how long it takes for people to die of cold, that can save a lot of people. All right. And that is actually an ethical approach, which would be our ethics are that we want to do the most good for the most people. And, for a few people might have to sacrifice so a lot of people can benefit. That's a sort of a, how you'd say that, they're sort of just adding up the benefits again, cost versus benefit. And that's not allowed in medical research. Medical research, we use this word deontology, and deontology means that that research must be within every sort of ethical standard that we have for the individual. So in other words, you can't hurt the individual, even if it's going to give you a benefit to the rest of the world. You can't hurt the individual, right? So I guess the people in 1944 in Poland would disagree with that, but that's the rules that we have now. And it was more or less because of that. Yeah. So those would be the universally recognized norms. As it says, the Association of Internet Researchers, AOIR, they have been setting some standards for research. And we got two basic important standards. One started in 2002 and the other one, well, it says here 2005, but they actually published in 2012 their particular standards. So the evolution of this standard, I guess you could say, the 2002 standard that came from the Association of Internet Researchers was that you protect the individual privacy and confidentially and informed consent of the individual. So that was the focus on the individual there, right? That was the focus on the individual, that we protect their privacy and their confidentiality. In 2012, what came out of that is, you know what? Not every individual is the same. There are particular types or groups of people that are especially vulnerable. And so our research with them has to be at a higher standard. And so that would be children. Okay. Actually, they mention inmates in prison inmates. But basically anybody who, so now why I'm thinking the prison inmates, I hadn't thought that through, but I'm thinking, why would the prison inmates be considered a vulnerable population? Well, I guess it would be like this, right? They can't move, right? They're in the prison, right? They're in their cell. If you go in there and say, hey, we're going to experiment on you, where are they going to go, right? So they're already limited in their freedom. And if you're sort of imposing things upon them without their consent, yeah, that's kind of bad. Whereas like adults like us, you know, somebody comes to us and says, we're going to do some research, and we say, no, you can't come into my house and do it. You know, you'll have to have my consent, and I'm not giving it. It's a lot easier for us, right? And likewise, it's a lot easier for us than children who could be presented with, here's a candy, let's do some research. You know what I'm saying? They don't have the same sort of processing. All right. All right. So we gather some data from people, and some of the places that we might gather data, there might be some ethical issues that come out of that. One would be terms of services from using an application or something on the internet. So we go to that application on the internet, and we choose we agree to the terms of services. And when we do that, we never read it, right? Nobody ever reads that. But in that terms of services, it says, any data that we get from you, we can share it with whoever we want, we can sell it and all that kind of stuff. So that's awesome, right? So as a researcher, we go along and say, hey, what about all of your users on that system? We want to get all this data from them. Yeah, no problem. They signed the terms of service. So, all right. So I see by the look on their faces when I say that maybe you don't agree with that. Okay, so maybe it's not a good thing. So maybe that's not ethical. So maybe we need to have a higher standard of that. Yeah. And so that does come up as an issue. So here's some other issues that come up. Copyright, we'll talk about that in a bit. Revealing identities, people need to have their privacy. That's what we mean by identities. Private space is the same, respect, obviously. Recruitment, that has to do with who's going to be in our study. Research with minors, this keeps coming up, right? What my advice to you, when you go out there and start doing research, don't do it with kids. It's going to be not worth your while unless you have a particular interest in that, right? I mean, it's going to be a real problem. You're going to have to go through a lot of hoops to get your research approved. It's going to be just way too much trouble. The anonymity, why do we have the dog there? In the 1990s, there was this meme, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. I mean, basically what that meant was that people don't know you, right? You could be anything sitting on the other side of that keyboard. And so that has to be taken into account if we're sort of trying to contact people over the internet. We don't really know who they are, right? So how much trust can we have in whatever it is they're saying, right? Now, the Belmont report, and I put some things in there, but you can read a bit more about that. I put a little bit on the homepage, but the Belmont report sort of came up as a result to some of these issues. Basically just says that you have to protect people's confidentiality and you have to protect their privacy. So we need to define what is confidentiality and privacy. Do we say it there? I think so. Maybe it's in the next slide. Yeah, here it is. There's our confidentiality. Confidentiality is that we restrict the number of people or the type of people who are going to have access to this data. So when you have a small group of people that have a secret, that's confidential, right? And if you take that secret outside of that group, then you're breaking their confidentiality, right? So you could have confidentiality with your subjects in a research. So you say to them, yeah, we're going to maintain your confidentiality. If you say that, what you mean is nobody else is ever going to know that this data. And that's kind of a hard thing to promise, right? Because you're probably going to record it on a computer medium somewhere. So that might be on a hard drive. That might end up on a server. Somebody might hack it. Okay, so if you're really promising people confidentiality, you might actually be promising them that as soon as I'm finished doing my research, I'm going to delete all this stuff. And I'm going to make sure there's no more copies. Maybe you have to do that. Anonymity is slightly different. I mean, anonymity just means that, okay, we might share the data that we got from the research, and that'll stay there, and that'll end up on those hard drives or whatever. But nobody will be able to know it was you. So that's what we mean by anonymity. Maybe that's a little bit easier. So what we do is we sort of remove any identifying information, people's names, birthdays, where they live, all that stuff. Anything that somebody can use together to figure out who this is. We just remove that from everything that they've given us. And that's basically almost mandatory. You probably just have to do that. Unless, there is the opposite of that. Sometimes on the internet, people are posting things in a public space, and they know that everybody can read it. They're not trying to be private. They're in a public space, but they don't want people copying what they said and saying it was somebody else. They want to be attributed. You know what I mean? That they think that what they said is worth something, in which case you may have to ask them, can I use what you said in my report? Basically, they have a copyright. There's an implied copyright when you start posting things on web pages and stuff like that. And so if somebody's out there fully in the public, they might not have a right to privacy because they're in a public space, but they would have a right to a copyright on what they're saying. You can't just copy it and say, this is the thing, right? You might have to say, well, so-and-so said this, and then you might have to ask them if it's okay. You might have to. As I said, generally considered that on the internet, that is a copyrighted space, but it's also a public space. And what's public is public. So copyright, as I said, you don't actually have to go to a patents office or anything like that and fill out forms to get copyright. All you have to do is say, this is my stuff and I copyright it. Right. Okay, so what that means is nobody else can use it without your permission, not in whole, right? So that would, if you make a website or you create some software, that's true. So that means if you're a researcher and you're using somebody's website or somebody's software, well, you need to sort of bear in mind that. And revealing the identity, I think I've mentioned that. You don't want to, you want to remove everything that might be used to identify somebody. And this is the same idea there, public versus private spaces. So on the internet, if it's like Facebook and people are posting a lot of stuff on there, that's public. And so, do they have a right to privacy? Maybe not, but they do have that right to copyright. On the other hand, if you're in a private sort of forum on the internet, and maybe that's a Facebook group which has been made private, and you're gathering information there, those people have an implied understanding that what they're doing is private, that the rest of the world isn't seeing it. You know what I'm saying? And so that's different, and you would have to respect their privacy. Yes, this nice diagram here about Svengensen's model, which is, all right, so we've gathered this stuff from the internet somewhere. We want to know if we can really use it in our research. And so what Svengensen says is there's two sort of continuums that we have to look at. And so she makes a matrix there. Okay, so on one side, we're looking at how public is it? Is it public or is it private? And obviously, the more private it is, the less chance there is for us to use it. Then the other thing that she looks at is it sensitive or non-sensitive? And so that's why we get down here in this corner here. When it's private information and it's sensitive information, basically you can't really use it in your research, right? Unless you find some way to maintain that privacy. All the other ones doesn't mean that you can use them. The question mark there is, how are you going to use them, and what protections are you going to use? So if it's private but it's not really sensitive, maybe you can use it, but you'll have to work out how you're going to do that, right? If it's probably up here where it's public and it's not sensitive, that's probably your best bet. But again, you still have to go through the right procedures. And then down here where it's sensitive and it's public, well, it's public, right? Again. All right, so I don't know if I need to go through all of that. Respect for persons. I don't like slides like this because there's a lot of words. I'm trying to look for the word that would be most important in there. Yeah. don't disclose people. So this is respect for their it's sort of repeating some of the stuff we've talked about privacy. People, all right. I'm just going to summarize it with just, yeah, be respectful, right? Don't violate people's rights. Yeah, all right. Now the recruitment, what we're talking about there is not hiring people to work for you. It's about who's going to be in your study. Who are you going to collect data from? That's what we mean by recruitment. And so that has to be ethical. And how could it be not ethical? Well, as it says here, you might target a particular group of people because of their social, racial, sexual, or other group. And that would not be ethical. I'll give you an example of that, which was the Tuskegee, well, the experiments that I mentioned to you that happened in World War II in Poland by Dr. Mengele. He targeted his victims, subjects. They were people that were in prison, right, in the concentration camp. And they were typically a particular group of people. And so that would be, well, obviously, but that caused there to be new laws that came out in 1945, immediately after the war, which basically said you can't do that. And that became like an international law. And it was actually called the Nuremberg laws. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Nuremberg. Nuremberg is a city in Germany, in Bavaria, I think. I've been to Nuremberg. Interesting place. But Nuremberg, they had war crimes trials. As far as I know, it's the first time in, well, certainly first time in modern history where they had war crimes trials. That is where the winners of a war collected the leaders of the loser of the war, and they put them on trial. And some of them were executed because of crimes against humanity. And so we got this concept of international law of crimes against humanity. So that was the Nuremberg trials. If you're ever interested in that, there's lots of movies about it. You can find out all about the Nuremberg trials. But so after the Nuremberg trials, they actually brought in these laws, which they called the Nuremberg laws. Actually, there was some earlier Nuremberg laws that came out in the 1930s before the war. And yeah, that was about things like, Jews can't do this and can't do that, those kind of things, right? So I had different kinds of Nuremberg laws. The ones after 1947, they were the ones that affect us now. Yeah, so I mentioned the Tuskegee, it was a syphilis trial. I don't know if you're familiar with syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease which causes all kinds of issues. People usually die young from it. It's a bad disease, all right? So it's been around for a long time. African-American men in, I think it was New York or Chicago, were put into a trial about the treatment of syphilis. And sort of most of them were not given any treatment. And they kind of thought they were. And, so that was seen as unethical because, you got these guys, come in here, oh, isn't that interesting? Look at all those boils you got. Let's just put that in our notebook. When there were treatments available for that. So that would be seen as unethical. Yeah, okay. There's some other things there too. I'll give you another unethical one. Okay, so the minors thing, I think I've gone over that. I've kind of hit on that a bit, right? Don't do research on minors if you can avoid it. Yeah, because of their vulnerable status, right? They don't really know what they're agreeing to, and they could be quite hurt by it. Now, actually, an interesting example of this, I think, kind of a minor. Would you consider a 16-year-old to be a minor? Maybe. There was this fellow, his name was Ted Kaczynski, and brilliant kid. Brilliant kid. All the way through school, he's just top of his class, doing all this math stuff. And because he's so smart, like when he's 16 years old, where does he go? He's finished high school and he's off to Harvard University. So he's a 16-year-old at Harvard University doing all this math and physics stuff, right? Because he's just awesome at it, right? Just really, really smart kid. And so while he's there, he he finds out about this psychologist who's doing some research on students. And that's the way back. Okay, this is the 1950s, 60s. Back in that time, that's what psychologists used to do. Oh, we want to do some study. Well, who do we study? Oh, we study the students, of course, because they're around here, right? We'll give them $20 or something like that, or else we'll give them free food, and they'll come and do research with. I mean, we'll be able to research on them. And so he was doing some study with this psychologist guy. What the psychologist guy would do, he would get Kaczynski to sort of write a report or give some ideas or something like that. And as I said, Kaczynski was smart, and he knew he was smart. And so he would give his ideas, which he would think of quite clearly. And then the head psychologist, the actual idea or the hypothesis that they were trying to test is, what would happen if we humiliate and negate the ideas of a person over a long period of time? How will that happen? So everything that he would say, they would say, oh, that's dumb. You know, you're really, really not very good at this. You know, why are you, this kind of stuff. That's what they were doing with Kaczynski. Now Kaczynski was, he's young, he's 16. Everybody else around him is at least 20 years old, right? Or 18. And they have friends, they just have a higher level of sort of socialization than he does, because he's just a little kid, basically. And they're doing this stuff to him. And so what happens, right? What happens when that, they go away and what do they say? They plot and they file, right? And so what did Kaczynski do? He got a job at Stanford University teaching math, because he was a PhD. He finished all of his studies. He's a pretty smart guy, goes there, and he doesn't like that. And he starts thinking, these people here, they're not really good. I don't like what's going on in the universities. It's just really bad. And so he started writing this manifesto, which is about how bad the modern world is, because technology just really hurts people. Well, it hurt him. Universities are really, really bad. And so are like big companies like telephone companies and the military. These people are just really, really bad. We were much better off before we had them. And he's sitting in this little cabin in Montana. I mean, the cabin isn't as big as this room. It's like half as big as this room. And, he's just really angry and just writing this stuff. Anyway, so he gets angry enough. He starts sending bombs in the mail to people at universities, to people in telephone companies. And he killed a few people. And, eventually they got him. And not before he published his manifesto in I think it's the Chicago Tribune. And it's brilliant. I mean, you might read it and you might say, oh, yeah, the guy's right. But maybe he would have had a better way of sort of getting that across. If you're interested, name's Ted Kaczynski. He was called the Unabomber, and there's a Netflix about him. There's lots of stuff. You can learn all about Ted Kaczynski. I don't know if he's still alive. I think they might have executed him, but maybe not. All right, so emerging issues, the thing there about Facebook and privacy. I think I've sort of covered that pretty much. And that is kind of it. Any questions? I enjoyed that. I hope that was all right with you guys. So I did record it. And so that will be on I'll put that up on D2L.